Okay, thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better. I've just muted John for John's reference to unmute when he's up. My name's Robert Hayworth. I'm a sports scientist at Catapult Sports. We essentially set off on a journey a couple of weeks ago. We decided that we wanted to run a series of webinars. It's kind of a unique opportunity in unprecedented times for the entire world, that we wanted to try and utilize our network of individuals across the world to give you something unique. And yeah, we felt we were in the right position to be able to do that. So over the next 8 weeks, we've got 2 sessions every single week on different sports, different backgrounds, different individuals. So everything from sports psychology, we've got ex-players, we've got sports scientists, we've got coaches, and we've tried to really go across the board. And like I say, we've got lots of different sports. So today we've got 2 guys with us, Dr. John Fitzpatrick and Tom Williams, both in soccer or football, depending on where you are in the world. And we're fortunate enough to have Lauren Green and Robin Thorpe with us on Thursday. And we'll continue to announce as we confirm speakers over the coming weeks, but we've also got an ice hockey one and a American football webinar scheduled for next week. So hopefully that'll go out either today or tomorrow. And now that you're all registered, you will all automatically get a invite to that. So 24 hours before and 1 hour before, you'll just get a notification with all the link details. Apologies today for any confusion. We had a little bit of issues with Zoom, just getting our account to hopefully support the number of people that may be joining today. So we had over 1,500 people registered, so we had to go and upgrade our account so that we could handle some of those numbers that we've got. And throughout the session for today, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to post them. We'll have a little Q&A at the end of both presentations. So John will go first, and it's approximately half an hour presentation, and then some time for Q&A. And then following that, we'll have Tom's presentation. So to introduce John to get started, John has spent the last 7 years at Newcastle United, working in the academy. Alongside that, he's obviously now a doctor, so PhD level study with our technology, and should be able to give some really interesting insights in his presentation on the physical development framework of Newcastle United Academy. So yeah, without further ado, I'll pass on to John if you want to unmute yourself and get started when you're ready.
Thanks, Rob. I'd just like to thank everyone at Catapult, firstly, for the opportunity to present today. I'll flip on, this going to work. There we go. So I'm going to present what we've termed our physical development framework at Newcastle United Academy. It's a great opportunity to present this to quite a wide audience. It's something we've been developing over this last season, and it is still a work in progress, but it's a great chance to share certain aspects of that and hopefully get some feedback and questions at the end. So straight away, I'd just like to say it's very much been a team effort pulling this together over this season. Might be the one presenting today, but everyone there on the screen has contributed towards this development process. From our under 9s all the way to the first team. We're trying to get a sort of streamlined approach in terms of how we develop players at Newcastle United. So this is just a sort of visual schematic of what the process is we've been through. Starting right at the top in terms of the club's vision and mission. Then the academy's vision and mission will then lead into that. So that is to try and produce players on a regular basis that can play in our first team. Then our sports science department's vision and mission feeds into that, and I'll go into that. And then from there onwards really forms the basis of our framework, and I'll take you through each of these steps. Next step down is then our goals and objectives to help us try and meet that vision. And we break that down further into what do we think are the critical success factors that we need to be able to achieve those goals. And then for each of those success factors, how do we measure it? If we're saying it's something important, we need to be able to measure it. Ultimately, then, how do we improve it? And then the final step in sort of closing the loops, how do we then measure the impact we're having? And taking us right back up to the top in terms of, are we having an impact on those success factors? Are we meeting our goals and objectives? And are we getting somewhere close to achieving our vision and mission? So in terms of our sports science department, our vision, sort of headed up by Simon Twaddle, our head of Academy Sports Science, was to deliver world-leading sports science support. Now, to try and achieve that, we've set out 3 sort of mission statements. So the first is around, well, they're all around what I'm going to present today. The first is what we've been doing this season, try and develop a clear, sustainable and benchmark physical development process. Then within that, within the framework, we highlight what we think are our key physical preparation strategies. So what are we doing to try and support our players to realise their physical potential? And then ultimately at the end, the third statement, which to me is the most important, how are we then integrating this framework on a day-to-day basis to try and improve the performance of our players to sort of develop the next generation of Newcastle United players? So to give you a bit more detail of what our framework looks like, following on from our vision and mission, our 2 goals that we try to set out, we've tried to keep it really simple sort of strap lines that anyone looking at this can understand. So our 2 goals are to be ready and robust. In terms of ready, we mean that's ready to perform, ready to step up to the next level, ready to step up into the first team ultimately and perform in the Premier League. And the other aspect of that is to develop players who are robust. Can they not just cope with the demands, but can they meet and exceed the demands of the Premier League? So are they robust enough to handle training, handle games, handle 40 games a season in the Premier League? The next step down from that then is these critical success factors. Again, we've tried to keep it sort of quite snappy, so we went with 3 S's: stamina, speed and strength, in terms of developing players that are ready to perform. And then on the other side, we feel that improving physical performance is a really key aspect of building robustness. And then ultimately, how do we manage our injury risk on a day-to-day basis? So then measuring these, we obviously have a testing battery that we perform a couple of times a season. I'll go into more detail on certain aspects of that later, including sort of on-field tests and profiling in the gym. And then in terms of the robustness side, we try and assess non-contact injuries. So that's the real thing we think we can have an impact on in terms of building robustness. Improving these factors, then we'll have integrated practice design. That's how does all the multidisciplinary team work together to try and design the practice on a day-to-day and weekly basis to improve the players. And then we also have conditioning programs, gym programs. Over on the right-hand side there, injury reduction will be a key part of our managing injury risk, and also our training load management and sort of fatigue monitoring with wellness jumps, etc. And then for all of these aspects, key things we're trying to look at is minimum detectable change. So we need to know, are our measures reliable, or what's the level of reliability? This idea of signal and noise. And then final bit that I'll go on to more towards the end of the presentation is trying to understand what's the practically important changes we need. So that idea of, in order to make players who are ready to perform in the Premier League, what sort of key performance indicators do we need? So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus more on the stamina aspect. We'll go through why we think stamina is important as a critical success factor. The 3 main sort of components we have in terms of measuring stamina, which is our fitness testing, our match performance, and subjective expert opinion. How we improve those, I won't touch too much on this integrated practice design because that could be a whole presentation itself, but then we'll focus more around our individualized conditioning program. And then ultimately some of the research at the end we've done around understanding detectable and practically important changes. So in terms of stamina as a success factor, I'm not going to repeat all the stuff you'll already know around the literature of why stamina is important as a determinant of football performance. The 90-minute game, players are covering between 10 and 12 kilometres in a game. All of these things mean that it's really is a key thing for that sort of duration, the aerobic capacity. But the more important thing for me is always this idea around if we can improve aerobic capacity or stamina, we're likely going to then mitigate some of the fatigue players see acutely within the game, and then speed up that recovery process, possibly post-game. So we've got there sort of improving aerobic capacity will reduce these metabolic byproducts within the game that if you're limiting then the anaerobic contribution. We've also seen in the literature there's a positive relationship between maximum aerobic capacity and physical match performance. And then at the end, I'll show some of our research we've done around reduced fatigability following players who have increased stamina, increased aerobic capacity. When we look into the literature around what is stamina, you can normally break it down into three components, three determinants. We'll probably say that in football, in football training in particular, we're not really focusing on lactate threshold or running economy, I wouldn't think. We're not really anymore doing the longer steady state runs to improve lactate threshold, and running economy might sometimes be a byproduct of certain aspects of our program, such as trying to improve running mechanics or the work in the gym. But probably when we talk about conditioning programs in football, we are generally trying to focus around VO2 max and how we improve that aspect. So we can break that down further into, on the left, you've got oxygen transportation, so that's more of your central adaptations. On the right, oxygen utilization, so that's more the peripheral adaptation. And we can choose different sort of drills, different combinations of drills. Work on Martin Bouchette, different weapons, he would call it, to target different aspects of this VO2 max improvement. So now how do we try and measure these factors at Newcastle United in terms of stamina? So as I mentioned, we have these three different components that we will look at, but that's sort of broken down further in terms of age group specific within the academy. So we will conduct the mass test, we'll assess physical match performance with the teams we have GPS data coverage on. That will be our first team down to under 16s. And then this idea of subjective expert opinion will run right through the academy, where we're asking coaches to rate players, and I'll show you a bit more on that. First of all, our mass test, very basic. Probably a lot of you have done something similar in the past. We've sort of designed one of our pitches so that we can cut the corners off to create a 300-meter running track. So 5 laps of that will give us our 1500-meter time trial, and the time taken to complete that will give us an estimate of maximum aerobic speed. This has been shown to be a good, or sort of quite good measure of speed at VO2 max, your more laboratory-based assessments, and shown good validity to that in certain studies. We typically try to do this with the academy players 4 times a season. So we have a pre-season assessment, an end of pre-season or start of the season, and then a mid-season and an end of season assessment as well. This is how it sort of breaks down in terms of benchmarking for our different age groups. So if you think the quicker the speed, the higher your maximum aerobic speed is. So from under 12s down to under 16s, we see some quite large improvements in maximum aerobic speed, and then more of a steady improvement from under 16s to under 18s, under 23s. We try and then break it down further. So if I use the under 18s as an example, we'll then benchmark our players and try to categorize them based on their percentile rank within our data set. So we look at whether a player is good, excellent, average, below average, or poor, based into these 20 sort of percent bracket categories. So anyone who is classing as excellent would be in the 80th percentile, and they'd have to achieve a time of over under 5 minutes 9 seconds for this 1500-meter time trial. So we can then do that for each age group and understand where that player is in terms of their aerobic capacity. The second aspect we will look at is physical match performance. So in terms of match performance, we're assessing that with first team down to our under 16s. First team is our stadium tracking system. So the under 23s, under 18s, under 16s will be with the Catapult Sports GPS units. And we now have in the academy probably around 6 seasons worth of data. That works out at about 1,000 data points per age group. And then if you break that down in position, we've got probably 100 data points per position per age group. So we're starting to build up a good picture across seasons, across different players, across positions, what our typical benchmarks are. In terms of just squads as a whole, you can see if we use total distance per minute as a sort of proxy measure of stamina, We see a bit of a jump up from under 16s to under 18s in terms of meters per minute, but then not really much of a difference from under 18s to under 23s to our first team. There is, however, as you all know, large positional differences. So you can see there what you'd expect. Your centre defence is probably the lowest in terms of distance covered compared to your centre midfielders who will be covering the greatest distances. We'll then break that down further. Similar approach to the mass. So if I use the under 18s as an example for our centre midfielder, we'll try and benchmark this player against the historical data we have for that position. So in terms of his average meters per minute, we can categorise as that excellent, good, average, below average, or poor. Now, we're not really saying here that running more in a game is better. What we're trying to say is over this quite a longitudinal period of time, 5 or 6 seasons, we think we have a good understanding of what the demands are of that position, and what we want is to give the player the capacity to meet whatever the demands may be. We want the demands to be as low as possible because we're dominating teams technically and tactically, but sometimes we will need that greater capacity to be able to outwork teams in our academy and first team. And finally, this idea of subjective expert opinion, we use this when possibly more objective monitoring tools aren't available, particularly in our younger age groups, or as a sort of added qualitative approach. So we ask the coaches to come up with some position-specific football actions, which they've come up with themselves in terms of terms for each position and what they feel stamina is on the pitch. And the coaches will then rate the players alongside the team sports science. For example, the centre midfielder, that might be something like, can they maintain work rate and influence the game for 90 plus minutes? Can they repeatedly attack and recover box to box? These sort of real life on pitch examples of what our coaches think stamina is, and then they will rate the player to back up our sort of objective data that we have, or sort of counteract that. So taking all of these 3 components into consideration, we've come up with this decision chart. So starting at the top, we'll assess, is the player's mass at the benchmark, age-specific benchmark we think there needs to be? Where's their physical match performance at? And then thirdly, what's that subjective expert opinion telling us? So as an example, this centre midfielder, he's got an excellent maximum aerobic speed. He's very good. He's got good physical match performance in terms of meters per minute for his position, and the coaches are rating him as excellent as well. So going down the sort of decision chart, yes, 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 we can say that his stamina is very good, and we'll try and focus on other areas of physical development. Conversely to that, we might have a player who's an attacking midfielder here who's below average. His match stats are telling us he's poor in terms of his position, and the coaches are also seeing that on the pitch with their assessment. So we definitely want to try and develop stamina in some way. Another example of sometimes what we see is this player's got good maximum aerobic speed for a fullback. However, his match stats will be saying is below average, and this is where it comes into play, where we're not just always saying running more in a game is better. So our coaches actually rate him as good in terms of stamina on the pitch. From what they see, they think he's doing what they want him to do and meeting the demands of the game. So we're quite happy that we know he has the capacity from the mass test. The coaches feel like he's applying that in the game, so we would then look to maintain that and develop other areas of performance. Final example, which is another one we sometimes may see, is someone who has good maximum aerobic speed, runs a lot in a game, so we classify him as excellent in terms of an attacking midfielder. However, the coach is saying he doesn't meet the required level they think in the game, so he's not taking that capacity and transferring that into a game. So that could lead us down sort of both aspects of this decision chart, but probably what it's telling us is, in the bottom right there now, that he needs to develop more of his tactical understanding. So he's running around a lot in the game, covering a lot of distance, but the coach is wanting him to do other things with all that capacity. So we probably look physically to develop something else because we know he's very good aerobically, but the coach needs to work with the player as well to develop his understanding. And that's a really good example of how all of these 3 assessments can work together and feed into each other to ultimately come up with the training program for the individual. So now, how do we improve this factor of stamina? As I mentioned, integrated practice design probably takes up 95% of what we do in training program, and a very small percentage for certain age groups will be this individualized conditioning program. We tend to see we will use this program from under 15s upwards, so that as you get progressing through the academy, we'll then try and supplement your training with an individualized conditioning program, whereas with the younger age groups, we try more to get what we need in terms of stamina from our training sessions. So working with the coaches in terms of practice design, putting constraints on practices to develop stamina or speed or other aspects of their performance. So in terms of our conditioning program, I've tried to summarize sort of the highlights into one slide here. We've taken a lot of influence from sort of the work of Martin Bouchette and Paul Larson in terms of going from longer intervals up to sprint intervals where we need to develop speed in a play. Typically what we'll see is, I've highlighted there the sort of longer interval section. This will come more in the sort of return to play aspect in rehab possibly, or this will be more of your games-based approach in training. You know, very rarely will we be running a squad of players doing the classic Helgerud 4-minute runs, things like that, but that often will come in the earlier stages of rehab. So what we see with the team who are training is that we normally put them into one of these 4 groups. So the players who we think need to develop stamina will perform a 30-30 interval protocol, which we found really effective for improving maximal aerobic speed. The other side of that is someone who could be very good in terms of stamina but needs to improve their speed. We'll work on sprint intervals, and I'll show some research later that backs up why we're doing this sort of program. Finally, I just want to mention that at the top, if you can see, we've got how we monitor. In terms of stamina, a key thing for us is we'll monitor the time above maximal aerobic speed through our GPS unit. So we put in an individual threshold for each player into the Catapult open field system, and we can then assess the time they spend in training above that threshold, and that's a real key marker for us in terms of monitoring stamina. Something we're now trying to reduce is, for this sort of middle ground of stamina and speed, we look at 30% anaerobic speed reserve as a threshold. So that's your maximal aerobic speed plus 30% into your anaerobic speed reserve. So there's a sort of anaerobic threshold. And then the final thing is, if we're looking to monitor speed in a player, we'll assess time spent above 90% of maximum sprint speed. So I'll go on now onto some of the research we've done, which sort of backs up why we do what we do and how we've come to develop the program we have. In terms of stamina, if you look at the figure on the left, we found there's a really strong relationship between weekly time above mass and changes in stamina. So over a 6-week period a few seasons ago, we monitored our players, just looked at the different amounts of time above mass they were producing, and we saw this really strong linear relationship. So what this model's telling us is that typically, to sort of maintain fitness, have no change, we'll need to get around 6.5 minutes a week of time above mass. And we can see that we can get that from normal sort of typical training and match play. So we might not need to do any conditioning with the players to maintain fitness. We can get that through our games-based training program and our playing once a week. However, someone who needs to improve their stamina needs to try and achieve upwards of 9 minutes per week. We've tried really hard this season to sort of work with the coaches and get integrated drills where we're trying to work on increasing time above mass in our football drills. However, we found it very difficult. If you think someone's maximum aerobic speed might be 17 kilometers an hour, to accumulate the amount of time you need working above that threshold in a sort of intermittent games-based activity, it's really hard. So that's where, you know, these 30 on 30 off protocols come in handy. You can do 6 runs and get close to that 2.5 minutes extra a week you need to get above that 9 minutes a week threshold. So if you think of our sort of research model, is that once we found a relationship, we then need to go out and test it. So something we did was an intervention study, put players into 2 groups. One group did sprint intervals, one group did these 30 on 30 off maximal aerobic speed group. And what we saw was the group that did that achieved around 10 minutes per week time above mass, and they got a substantial improvement of around 3% in stamina over that 6-week period. So that was sort of validating the model that we saw in the previous slide. Conversely to that, the sprint interval group, surprise, surprise, improved their sprint speed. And we did sort of miss a trick in this study in that we weren't at that time monitoring this idea of time above 90%. But that is something we'll be looking to do in the future. So similar to the time above mass, is there a dose response relationship between time above 90% and changes in sprint speed? I think it's becoming more and more apparent in the minute that to improve sprint speed in soccer players, you've just got to sprint fast at 100% and sprint regularly to try and improve that. You know, the technique work and the gym work we do helps a lot, but you've just got to get out on the pitch and sprint fast as much as you can. Just as a little aside in terms of this idea of fatigability, the key thing for me with stamina is that we don't just want players to be fit and run a lot for the sake of it. Improving stamina can have a real important effect on how much fatigue players feel from a given workload. So alongside that study I mentioned with the 2 interventions, we assess players' fatigue response post-training at the start of the intervention and then 6 weeks later. And what we saw was a clear reduction in the amount of fatigue accumulated from a given training session 6 weeks later in those players who had an improvement in stamina. So improving stamina can then also reduce the amount of fatigue players are seeing for a standardized workload. So we've got there that 3% improvement in stamina. We saw around an 11% reduction in subjective fatigue for that. So on to now, for me, the most interesting part is then how do we measure our impact? How do we see, is our training program working? Is it helping us achieve our goals? So I've mentioned there again, this looks a very linear process, but we're trying to close the loop in terms of going back up the chain once we get to the KPIs at the bottom. Are we improving stamina? Is that then helping us achieve our goals? And are we getting some way to achieving our vision and mission? As I mentioned, the first step for us always in terms of any assessment is understanding reliability, which for us we use minimum detectable change. So that allows us to understand, has a real change occurred, or if we're assessing players post an intervention, is that just noise in the test? So if you look at the figure on the left, this is our MDC curve, and we use a threshold of 75% to say that we're happy a real change has occurred. So for this test, that will be around 4.6 seconds. The real key for me to using this sort of analysis is we're not just publishing the 75% and saying this is the reliable threshold. You know, practitioners could be not happy with 75%. They want to be 90% sure that they've got real changes. So then you can select any sort of confidence level you want for your assessment then. And that's the real key to going forward, I think, in research and applied practice. The next part then is then understanding, so good, we know what is our threshold in terms of things being detectable, in terms of reliability, but that 4-second improvement might not mean nothing out on the pitch. So we use this term minimum practically important change, which we got from some of the really good review by Robin Thorpe and Greg Atkinson, looking at this idea that they've taken from, often used in medicine, in terms of what dose of medicine is needed to get an important outcome in terms of whatever that medicine's trying to cure. So similar for us, what change in stamina do we need to get a really practically important change to achieving our goals or something out on the pitch? So an example might be what level of stamina is required to increase the probability of one of our players making a first team debut. Now that might not be, we might try and look at the data we have and there's no relationship, but I think we should always be striving to understand these real key things that we're looking at. Like I said, however, this is largely unknown, so that'll be a real key area for us developing over the next few years. I'll give you 2 examples of the process we've been through to try and get along this way of thinking, so you can take some examples away with you. From that previous study I mentioned, the intervention study, this was the relationship we saw between improvements in mass and changes in fatigue response. So in that other slide I showed that around that 3% improvement in stamina over on the left here equated to a substantial reduction in fatigue. So we're able to say now, you know, the reliability is telling us we need to see a change of around 1.5%, but to get a real improvement in sort of reduction in fatigue, we might need double that and a 3% improvement. So that's now telling us 3% might be a practically important change for certain individuals. Conversely, we see a bit of a lower threshold for muscle soreness. So we need to see only a 2% change in stamina to see a reduction in muscle soreness. However, then from possibly a more objective measure, drop jump RSI, we need to see a lot greater improvement in stamina to see a substantial improvement in drop jump RSI following in terms of fatigue monitoring. So following a session, we see a decrease in drop jump RSI. To substantially reduce that decrease, we need around a 6% improvement in stamina. Finally, last example, something we've conducted a few years ago based on our testing battery from the EPPP. We try to group all of our tests together to create our academy performance rating, which is a score from 0 to 100 based on a whole range of tests to try and give us an overall athletic rating for a player. And we can then look at how our players develop throughout the academy. So we've got the age group averages there for an under 9 all the way up to an under 23 player. Something we then looked at is for our key age groups when we're looking at retain and release, in terms of under 12s, under 14s, under 16s, what do the players look like in terms of who we retain and who we release? And we saw we tend to retain the players who are physically stronger than their peers, which might be, we would like to think is a good thing. That then led us on to looking at, well, can we actually understand in terms of probability then, what does different athletic performance ratings mean? So this is an example for our under 16s. We performed a logistic regression model to understand for a given athletic performance rating on this figure on the left, how does your probability of being retained at that level and gaining a scholarship into the full-time program at the academy improve as you get a greater performance rating? And that's just some of the model statistics on the right there. It was quite a accurate model in terms of predicting who we should retain and release, purely based on physical performance. There's an example there, an under 16 player who has an athletic performance rating of 70. This model would say it has around a 39% chance of being retained. However, if we can improve that athletic performance rating through our programs, I've shown you some aspects of it today, up to 80, that chance of being retained then increases up to 63%. So for just a 10 unit increase in their athletic performance rating for under 16, we see their chances of being retained go all the way up by 24%. So that really helps us drive our program, and we understand then that these small changes in physical performance can have a real improvement in our players' chances of getting to the next stage. I just want to conclude again by showing you this schematic. Hopefully I've been through each step and given you a bit of an understanding of one particular aspect in terms of stamina of the process we've been through. And ultimately the key thing for me is that we've always got to have that vision and mission in mind. So, you know, I really like the story of NASA where you go in and ask the cleaner, what's your job here? And he says, to get a man on the moon. You know, we should be able to ask anyone in the academy, what's your job in the academy? And it's to get players in the first team. We all know that each department and each individual have different goals and objectives within that, but our overall goal as the academy is to produce players for the first team. We all always need to have that in mind. Thank you. Hopefully that was enjoyable. And as I said right at the start, we really do want to get some feedback on this, and questions are welcome. I know this might not be the best forum for questions, but I'm always available at the minute on Twitter. And if you're interested in some of the research I've mentioned, you can have a look on ResearchGate. All the papers and presentations should be on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Cheers, Rob.
Yeah, really fascinating. And yeah, love the presentation. We've got quite a few questions that have come through, so I'm going to do my best to kind of filter.
Yeah.
One of the main themes coming out from the guys is around maturation.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think the data you presented was all in the different age groups that you've got. How do you kind of account for that biological age in those models? Obviously, you've done along those lines.
Yeah. If I can flick back to that slide. So something we have looked at is, like you said, that biological age. So this is based on chronological age. We'll get our players' age from peak height velocity. And we've seen in the academy that the average age of peak height velocity is around 13.7 years. So if a player is predicted to go through peak height velocity at 12.7, that would tell us that they're a year ahead of where the average player is. So we would add a year on to their biological age, if that makes sense. Conversely, a player who's predicted to go through at 14.7, we'd take a year off. So there, if you imagine that green dot might be an individual, we'll plot the sort of individual on that graph in terms of chronological age and then also biological age. So that, if you say that under 16 red dot is actually a year younger, that dot would go across to the under 15 level, and then we might see in terms of biological age, they're actually where we think they should be, even though this graph's telling us that they're underperforming in terms of chronological age. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. No, that's really good. It's great to see that you've taken that in and put that into your models already. So, yeah. Other questions that I've got here. So I think you mentioned quite a lot around more of the physical drills that you guys do to attain the outputs that you want. Do you mix this up with more small-sided games and more technical drills and like more of a focus on change direction? Everything kind of presented at this point was more straight line linear running. So just whether there's anything you can expand on what you would do and target.
Yeah, so I'm aware I didn't really touch on that at all, but that would all fall into this idea of integrated practice design. So that's where me as the sports scientist would be working with the coach to try and put constraints, as we're calling it, on the practices. So if that's small-sided games or crossing finishing drills, to try and get different physical outcomes. And that'll form probably around 95% of our training program. We have a very much a football-first approach. But we've seen that to really improve certain aspects, our philosophy is we need to then sort of be very specific. So if it's stamina we want to improve, targeting that through that individualized program. We only do it once a week. It might be for about 10 minutes at the end of one session, but that can really give us some good improvements in stamina or speed if that's the area we're looking to improve. So our philosophy at the minute is football first. So we're trying to get everything we can from football drills, but then to really target specific physical qualities. We think we need a bit more specific, and then sort of overload. The principles of specificity and overload, I think, need to be specific on that physical quality and then try and overload it to improve it.
Perfect. So you take out live monitoring at that stage and try and give people individual targets as they're going live, or is that all?
We haven't got to that stage yet, but we will. Sort of everyone will have an individualized distance they need to run, or be in one of those individual groups. Those 4 groups I showed, we could have a squad of 20 players all in different groups, running different distances based on their maximum aerobic speed. And then we can then get that sort of live, or we see it's very reliable. If we target a certain amount from a drill, we tend to be pretty accurate in terms of getting what we prescribe from those drills.
Okay, perfect. No, that's great. We've got hundreds of questions coming in here, so I can't get through them all. So a question from myself, so I can't read them quick enough, was with this immediate impact that we're facing with COVID that's around the world at the moment, and I know loads of people are finding different ways to connect with their athletes and prescribe training. Is there anything that you're doing at the moment with that kind of stamina model and your sprint model? Is that being used to feed your remote training as well, or how are you
so when the academy first shut down, this is purely from an academy point of view. The first team have done something slightly different. We sort of put together a 2-week program, because that was the Premier League said we're shutting down for 2 weeks. So we put together a 2-week running program, which was very more based along the lines of the program I've shown. More specific drills that we wanted to try and sort of maintain the level. Hopefully, we thought we were coming back in 2 weeks' time, but that's looking like it's going to run into the months now. So we've now changed that to more of a, we've called it like a menu we've given the players. So we basically just want them to get out and have fun and try and stay active in this period. We're not getting hung up too much on making sure they're doing this and that every day. And we have created a Strava group where we can sort of try and see what the players are doing. The coaches are in that and able to interact with the players through that. But we are trying to put the onus a bit more on them. So if they want to go out for a 5K run, that's fine. If they want to go out with their family on a bike ride, if they can and safe to do so, obviously. We just want them to stay active and try and do something sort of 4 or 5 times a week. And if we do get a definitive date of when we will return, I think that's when we'll try to be a bit more specific again. In terms of similar to like an off-season program, we'll probably give out. But at the minute, it's just in the academy point of view, it's around them just keeping safe and keeping active, really.
Yeah. And then like final one from my side, just as he starts to think about potentially going back and potentially, I guess, may not maybe affect you guys as much in the academy, but certainly at the first team level, there's all sorts of talk of having a World Cup style camp and games, and this sudden increase in load. I don't know whether the academy players will go through the same, but have you got any thoughts around how you might potentially, obviously with them keeping a very basic level of fitness, how you might potentially get them back and ready?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it'll be similar probably approach to we take in the off season, where we give the players a few weeks rest. So they've probably had more than that now, but as soon as we get a date, and hopefully that's we get a few weeks notice, I would think we'll then give the players something more specific to sort of gradually increase their load and get them used to running those longer distances, and get more specific in terms of sprint work and change of direction activities. So then hopefully they can hit the ground running when things do start up again. That's sort of our approach in the off season, to hit the ground running in pre-season. I think it would be sensible to take a similar approach in this scenario.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Thank you very much for your time again, John. It's great to see a lot of information and being so open with all the data that you've got there. I'm sure it'll be really valuable for everybody across the world who's watching, to see some of the things that's going on at Newcastle United. And there'll be very few clubs, I think, that will have the level of data and consistency that you guys have managed to achieve over this period of time. So yeah, fascinating stuff, mate.
Yes, thanks. No, as I said, it's been something everyone's worked really hard on this season. And we are looking to sort of get out there and, as I've done today, present things to hopefully get feedback and improve things further. So any questions people had that I couldn't answer or feedback, please do get in touch, and we'll be interested to hear people's thoughts.
Yeah, no problem. What we're going to try and do as well is set up a little channel in the catapult community, so we'll share details of that. I know John's got different ways you can connect with him as well, and a few people have asked me about his presentation, which I haven't asked John about yet. So we'll come to that afterwards, but maybe reach out to him directly, and he can make the decision whether he wants to share that presentation directly. The recording will be available on the community as well, so we'll share an email link with everybody afterwards for those that are asking, and yeah, we'll work through from there. So thank you very much, John. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and we can line up Tom? So next up we have Tom Williams from Toronto FC. A really great background, and very fortunate to have Tom on. He's certainly had a few clubs over the years. So just a quick look on LinkedIn, gets through Mansfield Town to Sheffield United to Leicester City to getting across the pond to Toronto FC these days. So loads of experience, and looking forward to the presentation on practical application of data in the planning process. So hopefully Tom's there and can share his screen when he's ready.
I am here. So I will share my screen.
As always, if anybody's got any questions at any point, keep firing them into the Q&A. I'll do my best to ask them, and we will come back to them if we don't get to them. So thanks, Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Rob. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and share some of my experiences. the main focus today is going to be looking at information and data and how that's ingested into a sports science and a program, and how that affects the global goals of the organization. So to begin with, just a bit of background on myself. I know Rob touched on it there. I was a failed football player, failed soccer player. Like many people in the industry, I ended up at Loughborough University, and whilst I was there, my goal was to become a coach, become a technical coach. I ended up working with Derby County Academy and Nottingham Forest Academy with their lower age groups. From then, an opportunity came to join Mansfield Town as what then was called the fitness coach. And those of you who have been a fitness coach will understand that you wear numerous hats at any point, that you are responsible for sports science, nutrition, potentially performance analysis, assistant coach, equipment manager. So all these things come together. That was my first experience working in senior football. And it was a bit of a baptism of fire, to be honest, but it was a fantastic learning opportunity for me to grow and develop and understand that this is where I see myself going in the future. From then I moved to Sheffield United as a rehab coach, so linking between the medical department and the performance department, working on the return to play of players there. I had 4 years there before moving down to Leicester City. I worked with Kev Paxton, who's the performance director there for the academy, to oversee the strength conditioning from the 9s through to the 23s. And it was a fantastic opportunity. It was a fantastic experience to be around such a forward-thinking club and the well-documented success that Leicester City had in winning the Premier League. It was great to be around that. That led me on to my job here at Toronto FC now. So working in different environments, different cultures, and different experiences were a key drive for me to get out here. And our performance director, Jim Liston, did a great job of selling me what Toronto FC are about and how the MLS is going to grow. So just a snapshot of where I've been and where I am now. And you can see I've kind of separated the coaching and the sports science side, mainly because I see myself as a coach first and foremost. Like, my passion is on the field, in the gym, directly working with the athletes every single day. When the science side, it supports me, but it's definitely a secondary process in how I operate. So everything is going to have a practical application throughout my presentation. So moving forward, to begin with, very similar to John's slide when we're talking about a collective vision and an organizational vision. So in 2016, when I came out to Toronto FC, our head coach, Greg Vanny, and performance director, Jim Liston, and the management team set out some clear objectives that the organization, the club, want to compete for multiple championships in North America and become a leader in research and innovation. So two very, very attainable goals, two very solid goals that we can look to generally interlink and support at any given time. Likewise, as a sports science department, the key goals were to, again, very similar to John's, that we want to increase athlete durability and increase athlete longevity. So talking about athlete durability, we want to create robust, resilient players, and we want to increase their opportunity for success over a longitudinal period. But the key is that all of these things interlink, and the sports science department needs to work in conjunction with the goals of the organization and the club, not working in isolation and in silos. So it's very, very important that we understand that that's how all the goals come together in one key area. So to compete for multiple championships in North America, we need our athletes to be, like I said, resilient and durable, so they can play multiple games in a period of time, very similar to some of the leagues in the UK, when the Championship, League One, League Two play multiple game weeks. Likewise, following this COVID pandemic, the MLS is going to be condensed, and we're going to be playing a potentially congested season. So we need to ensure that our athletes are durable enough to deal with those demands. Then linking in becoming a leader in research and innovation, that then prolongs the chance for players to achieve more success, the club to achieve more success, and the players to have a larger financial gain come the end of it. So all of these factors interlink, and we're always following this top-down, bottom-up vision. So some subcategories involved with the sports science department would be to create a web of support. And I kind of like the term web of support, because those of you that work in the performance industry will know that there's so many different things that fall between the cracks that generally sports science departments you have to try and quantify and pick up and try and affect. And with that information, then we look to interlink various departments and deliver key messages to various stakeholders. So there's a lot of factors that end up coming intertwined and interlinked with the data that we're looking to achieve. But the main outcome is that to achieve longitudinal success, we need to be reading the same book, let alone being on the same page. So that's our starting point as to how our data and our information is processed to support the organizational goals. So then moving forward into where do we start with this information and this data? And then there's so much information readily available to us now that it can be potentially overwhelming. And this can come from many different factors. If you are a new graduate or a young coach moving into a different role, that you see all this information and it's very much overwhelming, that there's wearable tech coming in from external, internal loads. If you're in an academy setting, you're dealing with maturation data. Likewise, if you're an experienced coach or a seasoned coach, that you're seeing upgrades in information like the Catapult Vector system coming now, and there's so much more information and more clarity that comes with it, which is fantastic for the industry. But again, it can be pretty overwhelming. And where do you start to decipher all this information is key. So I'm gonna name drop Amber Rowell in this. We had a little bit of banter moving forward when myself and our performance director, Jim Liston, we presented our process of information, which is known as the 5 C's, and Amber then coined it as the 5 D's of dodgeball. Well, it was pretty funny at the time, but the process we have in place are the 5 C's, and it's again similar to John's. The S's, it's something snappy, it's something easy that you can look to go back to at any given time. So to talk you through our 5C model, and this is going to take up a lot of the bulk of this presentation, that we're going to go through each C individually. So to begin with, the information that we collect, so the data that we're looking to ingest into our program, how does it support the organizational goals and values, and is it going to make us achieve longitudinal success? And that can come from, as I said, an array of different avenues, such as GPS, heart rate, wellness data, peak height velocity, maturation data, distance, time. But it's not always to say that you need to have this infinite budget. And those people who are working in clubs that are very forward thinking and can have a lot of money to back up their research and bring the data in, it doesn't mean you have to have this. It's great if you can have it as a gold standard. But if you look back to performance in its infancy, for example, Roger Bannister, when he was running the 4-minute mile, was distance and time, and that created his training program. There were 2 key objectives of data that he can collect. Then we look to increase that. As we're going through, we add more context to that information. So we need to determine how important that information is, how it affects the organizational goals and strategy. Then we add layers of information onto it. So that context then filters down to the communication side of things when we're looking to provide information to key stakeholders in our organization. That every layer needs to be different and dependent on the goals of that person you're looking to communicate with. And this is our head coach, Greg Vanny, and seeing this guy mad like this, it's nothing we want to see as a performance department. That's an example of potentially a broken down communication pathway, that our information is irrelevant and hasn't provided the context to engage this audience. Once we've moved through those C's, then we look to collaborate. That's when we're getting our heads together to deal with a situation and deal with something that can be actionable and affect the head coach's strategy, the management strategy to achieve this success. Then you come into the customizable area where you're looking to affect each and every individual every single day. And all this process is constantly interlinked. You can't generally look back and say, I'm going to collect some information and I'm going to throw this into my program without doing some due diligence along the way as to how it affects the amount of different people that you're touching every single day as a department, and that web of support to communicate this information. So as we move through, we're going to look at the collection side. And we know that winning and success is never a linear pathway, even though as many people think that it is. We need to be aware of that the challenges that come along the way. And like I said, from an organizational standpoint, Toronto FC are expected to compete for numerous trophies in the season. So we have the Canadian Cup, the Supporters Shield, MLS Cup, and CONCACAF, which we are expected to challenge for on a day-to-day, on a season-by-season basis. So from the information and data we look to ingest to get us there, we potentially need to take a little bit of a step back from those day-to-day metrics of data collection. If you move back and look at data and go, rather than just numbers and values, it can be information that we're bringing into our organization to see how these goals affect the end game. So you need to determine your metrics, what you deem important and what you value, but then they need to be very situational as to how do they fit in with the travel schedule, which I'll touch on later, that in MLS, we travel multiple time zones, different climates, different surfaces on a regular basis. Then how does the programming fit in at that moment in the season, from a strength conditioning perspective, from a physical exposure on the field to max velocity, reactive speed and agility, then looking at, is the mindset there for your athletes to achieve this success? So again, some information that we can ingest from a situational standpoint that can affect our day-to-day programming and how that data can be interpreted. But likewise, as I said, success is never linear, and it definitely looks a little bit more like this, where you're navigating through shark-infested waters with many trials and tribulations along the way and different things. And again, more layers of information from that initial collection phase as to fixture congestion. And as I mentioned, leagues in Europe, from the Championship, League One, League Two, fixture congestion is a regular occurrence. Likewise in MLS now, due to the coronavirus pandemic and us only played 2 games into a regular season, our season becomes condensed with more midweek games coming in. So that factor then potentially leads towards different situations of potential injury risk and wanting to mitigate that as much as possible, and knowing as a department that we're never going to eradicate that and being okay with that, but understanding that we need to reduce the risk by collecting as much information and data that is situational rather than just the day-to-day stuff. From there then leads to managing emotions. So emotional reactions, emotional decisions coming from coaches, from players, from management, and interlinking that into how that fits into all the athletes and people in your sports science community and organization as to their cultural background. Like Toronto FC, we have staff and athletes from North America, South America, Europe, and Asia that all have a different mindset and a different background and opinion as to what performance and performance training looks like. So to quote Martin Boucher on this, to throw a cluster bomb at it is never going to suffice. So we need to be very mindful of the information that we're looking to collect and be as broad as possible initially to see how our metrics and our day-to-day data collection can affect that from a situational standpoint. And that's not only dealing with all the crap that occurs on a day-to-day basis. And I know many practitioners, this is something that's great. And for me, running around with my head on fire and juggling cats all the time is something that keeps me on my toes and keeps things going. But there's constantly things on a day-to-day basis that go wrong. For example, technology not working, players not wearing GPS, not filling out wellness, not coming to the gym, all these other things that end up adding more context to that information that we're looking to collect from the earliest possible time. So we check a box of data collection. Then we move into our metrics, and it's fantastic from an industry. There is so much research readily available to guide us in directions of good quality information and applied research that we can add into our programs. But again, it can be pretty overwhelming, and knowing where to start is tough. And in my experience as a performance coach, that you can have a pretty broad lane of things that you look to measure and look to manage. But if you're constantly changing lanes all the time, that makes it difficult to nail your colors to the post. Then you're looking at your potential data ingestion going from 7 columns in your Excel sheet to 77 columns because you're constantly moving away from information. In my personal opinion, in my experience, it's nailing down what you value most from metrics you can collect and how that fits in to the organizational goals and your coaching philosophy to achieve success, and using this research and this information behind it to guide that process rather than becoming overwhelmed and potentially changing lanes constantly. And a great read is a book by John Doerr that talks about measuring what matters and putting in a strategy that focuses on objective key results and key performance indicators with different strategies to ensure success can be achieved in turbulent times with so much information going around. So it's a great read. I definitely recommend it in terms of adding into your sports science program. So then we can add another check mark to some information we collect, from situational metrics to day-to-day metrics. Then we come into the communication and contextualization. Like I said, all these C's overlap and interlink constantly. They're never working in isolation. So the schematic you can see in the middle of the chart here is kind of my web of support. And you can see there are different colors, there are different lines, some thicker, some thinner, some spottier, but they're all generally interlinked. And this is what we need to see as a communication pathway in our community of Toronto FC, that we're filtering through many different departments at any given time. And this is just some of the departments that we affect as a sports science team, from the academy director through to the medical director, performance director, head coach, goalkeeper coach, media. And there's so many more layers that come within that, talking about academy coaches, academy performance coaches, chef, nutritionist. The layers are endless, but we need to understand this as a sports science department, that we're interlinking multiple departments, and our lane, like I said, is pretty broad as to how we affect these different stakeholders and different people in our organization. And we need to ensure that the lines of communication are specific to the needs of that department and that person. So that's something that you can't walk into the head scout's office and say, hey, I've done this report, you should understand this. You need to take time and get to know, and in my experience is generally sitting down with them and not forcing conversations of how you can affect their role and make them more successful. Is getting to know them on a more personal level and understanding their beliefs, understanding how their department functions and how you support that, rather than trying to push the buck as to this is what the sports science department does. It needs to be specific to those individuals. And I'm going to steal some reports here from Martin Boucher again, from his "Do You Want to See My Report, Coach?" article, which is a fantastic read. And you can look at these three different reports, and let's say they're all looking at total distance. The audience who are receiving these reports around this schematic is going to be totally different. We can't have this one size fits all or this cluster bomb to ensure that everyone understands the same report. They might value different things. We need to understand how that can be interpreted by the audience. And I've been in this situation where you spend an eternity putting together this amazing, sexy looking report on Tableau or different data visualization tools, and you take it into your head coach or your director of football, and you present it to them very proudly, and they say, oh, thank you, I like the colors. And then it sits on the desk with the other 50 that they've got there. So you've missed the process in the C. So that you need to contextualize the information, make it specific to the end game, make it specific to the reader. And that information can be very varied, and it needs to be interpreted in the correct manner. So as we move through that, we can say communication key for every individual, and the information and context needs to be specific to that department. As we move through that now, we're going to add some more context and deal with some collaboration. And I'm going to use an example that is pretty common from a sports science or performance side, dealing with the technical staff. And our head coach, Greg Vanny, here, asking where my sheet of paper is. We'll come back to that in a few more slides. But I'm going to show you this chart, and everybody has seen this, right? This is nothing new. We talk about tactical periodization, and this is something that every coach or sports scientist, medical personnel have seen. And there's so many different ways of putting this information in various contexts. But if some people along your web of support don't understand what this information means, how can you add different context and still explain the same thing? So I'm going to give an example of, I was having lunch at our facility with one of our media staff, and we were talking about how we periodized the week at Toronto FC. So we train 4 days into the game, generally. But I didn't have my computer or a whiteboard or anything to show this. All we had was our lunch and the silverware around us. So using the silverware, and it wasn't this knife. I don't know why this knife would be left on the table, but we found the biggest knife that was available to us at the time. And that knife then represented game day. It was the sharpest knife. It was the biggest one. It can cause the most damage. From there, once that was agreed upon, we're going to work backwards from the game on the right-hand side. So into our tapering phase, we're going to use some different silverware. We're going to use a butter knife. A butter knife is pretty small. It can't hold a lot of volume. It's not too sharp. It's not too intense, but it can still give a dose. Likewise, 2 days before a game, we can use a teaspoon approach. The teaspoon is, again, it's a little bit bigger than the butter knife. It can hold slightly more volume, but again, it's not too intense. That's going to put us in a downward spiral of dealing with the big knife come game day. Once the tapering was agreed upon in the silverware, we worked into our loading or acquisition days where we used a knife and fork. And the knife and fork can generally get you through most meals in a day, right? You can poke, you can cut, you can do various things. Pretty solid utensils. So when we looked at game day -3, we use the fork because we're looking for multiple physical exposures. We want acceleration, deceleration, reactive change of direction, and max velocity exposure to come out this day. That's why we use the fork. It can cause a little bit of damage. It's fairly sharp. It can hold us a little bit more volume than the tapering days. But again, it's not anywhere near as big as the knife on game day. Likewise, our game day -4, 4 days out from game, this is our first day back in where we can use the knife. Again, the knife can't do a lot of things, right? It can cut and it can hold a little bit of volume. So we have 1 or 2 metrics attached to this from a conditioning standpoint and high-speed running. So we can acquire different metrics in these days and make that specific with the context of these different silverware. So when we look at our recovery stage, we're going to work from the game on the left forwards. That we work as a recovery day, the day post game, where we bring our silverware in, we wash our silverware, ensure there's no bent spoons, no bent knives, clean any blemishes off, and hopefully everyone's on the same page where we can wrap our silverware up in our napkin and lay it down for a day off the following day. So that information there is exactly the same that was on the chart, but the context around that is totally different for the audience that we're looking to engage. So likewise, adding another layer of context to it, you can work in percentages. A lot of people know what percentages are. And if you say, hey, game is 100%, they know what that means. They can be anyone in the organization. Then you can look to periodize different percentages across a training week. And like I said, this is one example of how different percentages can be applied at different days. And there's various ways of doing it. And you can see that I've left some question marks around certain training days. And that's all dependent on your squad status at that moment in time in your training cycle. That your game day +1 might mean more players need to go out on the field and train because they haven't played in this day. Likewise, your game day -4, the game day on the left might be the 3rd game in a week where you want to move some players around and the training load's effective. Likewise, game day -2, you want to see the response from game day -3 and how that affected. So there's various ways of managing this. And like I said, there's no one shoe fits all approach to it. But my point being that you want to add different context to information to ensure it's understandable and replicable in many different ways. So we're going to take that information now with the same context into a congested period. You can see we have our silverware approach, we have our percentages attached with various ranges on certain days. And you can see that the acquisition days have dropped out. We have more recovery days. At Toronto FC, we use a plus to insinuate we're recovering from the previous game and a minus preparing for the second game, where we need to ensure everyone's recovered on the same page before we start moving and start progressing match minutes and training load. So again, we look at it and go, we've got 3 different ways of representing this information. It should work. That's fine. We use our day-to-day metrics to ensure we get the exposure and outcome we need, but then you add in some situational issues. So you see we played Toronto, a home game on Saturday, then a away game on Wednesday, away game on the following Saturday, where at any given week in MLS, you can have sub-zero temperatures in Toronto, Colorado altitude, Dallas hot and humid in a training week, in a single week. So do those environmental changes affect the different silverware and percentages that you're going to apply on those certain days? Possibly, but it needs to be accounted for. Likewise, I said we fly commercial aircraft in MLS. We're crossing 3 different time zones, from Eastern time in Toronto to Mountain time in Colorado to Central time in Dallas. So how does that then affect the different silverware and percentages? Likewise, I said commercial aircraft. If you're flying out of Toronto in Air Canada, there's a good chance that 2 hours may turn into 5 hours. And then coming out of Colorado, if you're dealing with mountain climate, differences in weather may affect that. So we look at a scenario and going, okay, we've added different context. Then you throw something else into the mix constantly that you can potentially not objectively measure, but you need to be aware of as information that comes into your department and how this affects performance. Because generally we want to mitigate the risk of injury during this time. And there's a lot of variables that we need to consider in doing that. So again, working through from a training week and differences in fixture congestion to supporting daily training sessions. And my previous slide where I had our head coach, Greg Vanny, looking for his sheet of paper, this is probably it. And many people have seen this flying around in the wind on the field, or you've picked the jacket up from the equipment room and this has been in the pocket. That this is how coaches will operate, right? I've been in this situation. You have that piece of paper that has everything from the start of the session to the end of the session. And it's very, very easily understandable for their side. But if we're looking to collaborate and communicate information that we're looking to collect to become actionable, we need, as practitioners and performance coaches, to make sense of this. So myself and Jim Liston, the performance director, we talk about our head coach and go, hey, Greg, we've taken all your drills for the last couple of years and we've put them in Excel. So they're all in a list for you. So he's looking at me like that pretty skeptically, knowing that he's pretty happy with his 101 sheets of paper that are strewn around the training facility. But we add some context to that and say, well, these are your drills. And with these drills, what we've done, we've added 2 different values. We've added a volume and intensity metric. And if you want to get into this a little bit more, Jace Delaney's done some fantastic work on average acceleration density to look at the hardest points in training drills. But that's a whole other talk on that. But basically now I can report to our head coach that these are your drills. These are the costs from a volume and intensity standpoint. So when we're looking to pick silverware on certain days or add percentages to certain days, these drills now can pertain to different information that can be better used on those days. And from my experience as sports scientists, performance coaches, fitness coaches, that there are this conception that we are the grim reapers of training load, that we go up and we talk to the coaches and this standoff conversation of, he can't do that, I need to pull him from there, shouldn't do that today. And it's not a good situation to be in. So the level of trust isn't there. So in an instance, if it's a teaspoon day and our head coach is adamant that he wants to do a 3v3. So there's some different 3v3 games here. And as you can see, the volume intensity metric coming out of these is totally different from drills that are played on exactly the same dimensions. Again, that can be altered as well to increase or decrease the overall exposure from that. But if he's adamant that that's the situation, wants to do 3v3, then it's not a no. It's a communication process to say, well, maybe you just take the neutral player out of the 3v3 plus 1 and just play with 3v3, because then the volume and intensity measures are totally different. So we're manipulating the training load, the content, without changing and saying no. With that in mind, hopefully we get a smiling Greg Vanny at the end of it by collaborating and ensuring this ongoing education process that is a two-way thing. We need to support the technical staff and interlink their department with our department to affect the overall club vision. Then move into another situation here. This is a little bit more broad, that these are the goals scored and conceded. So goals scored in the yellow bar, goals conceded in the orange bars, with Toronto FC being on the far left in the red and black. These are the goals scored in the last 15 minutes of the second half of games from 2016 to 2019. There are a couple of teams missing from this because the data was only collated with teams who have played in at least 3 out of the 4 seasons. So as you can see from this, that in terms of goals scored, we are leading. So we scored 72 goals in the last 15 minutes of the second half in a 4-year period. And we're joint 4th for goals conceded. And this information can be interpreted in many different ways. And that's why contextual information is key. But if you're going through the C model and taking that information and trying to relate it to performance, you can say, well, Toronto FC can execute more high intensity movements in high pressure moments in games, making them more successful, when other teams potentially are maintaining or decreasing in some performance measures. Likewise, you can look and say, well, Toronto FC may have a deeper squad or may have significantly talented players in different areas that make the difference. Sure, that's another way of looking at it. But then you add context to that information and say, well, still those players need to be on the field on a consistent basis to ensure they're durable and they can play multiple games in a 3 to 4 year period to show this constant success. So another way of collaboration and linking in what the physical aspects can relate to performance on game day. And that's also communicating with your technical department to know how the game model is targeted from, if it's a high press, if it's a sit in and counter, then that changes because the physical exposures that we're training the players to do needs to fit within the methodology and philosophy of the coaches to achieve this success. So there's another way of collaborating on a different level and linking the departments together. So now moving into the final C of customization, that in this picture here, we have different positions. We have 3 midfielders circled in green. We have 1 center back in blue and 2 fullbacks in orange. And from the data that we're collecting and the information that we're ingesting into our departments, we need to know what each of these positions do on a consistent basis over a season. Like, what does a midfielder look like if Toronto FC are playing a 4-4-2 or a 3-5-2? Like, how do those variables change dependent on the game strategy and game methodology? Likewise, we need to look at every individual within this and see what they do, but we need to start with the positional game before we move into the individual profile. Likewise, cultural backgrounds. In this picture, we have from the center midfielders, a Spanish, Colombian, North American. We have a French central defender, a Brazilian fullback, and a North American fullback. So like I said previously, training backgrounds and context around that is key. So we need to ensure that we know their upside. What is their physical components that they excel at? How can we enhance those, as well as looking at what information do they need to be better at? What physical exposures and physical capacities can we increase to make this player more efficient and more effective on a game day? And again, it's originally thrown a cluster bomb, then you come in to have this laser guided missile to be specific for every individual every single day for the information that we're looking to achieve. And with that comes what we put forward for every player, which is our individual player cards. And this is just from a physical perspective, that we can look at our game day -4, 3, 2, 1, our best case of training with no midweek game, so we can have those acquisition days in there. And every individual player now will have specific outcomes dependent on medical checks, pre-training nutrition, during training, physical exposures, post-training, strength, mobility, power, as well as post-training recovery and post-training nutrition. So it's a snapshot of information that the player has on a daily basis that is all based around what they need for best case scenario on a game day. And this isn't something that I can sit at home and just magic together one day based on what I believe or what our department believes. You need to bring the player into it. So again, we're linking in a different department to ensure this is player-led information, that they understand why they need to do certain things on certain days, how having a maximal velocity exposure day on a game day -3 affects them in game day. So again, this continuous education process and having time to sit down and talk to your players to ensure they're involved in the overall goal of putting a performance program, performance pathway together for every individual. And it's a collage of information, right? It's never a finished article. It's never a painting that you can hang up and go, that's what we're doing for the season. This is ever changing, ever evolving, where you're adding different situations and different information into it to ensure it comes together. So then you can see, like I said, it's all based around the game day model, and I've scratched a few off there because it's dependent on each individual as to how this comes into play from the information we collect. So we become customizable in our information there. Then to recap, so going through our 5C model, that we need to ensure that this is a process that is regularly touched upon to ensure that information, data, and values can be applied to that customizable point. And just adding more and more and more, that doesn't make the boat go faster sometimes, or often doesn't transfer to customizable information. And Aaron Coates wrote a paper on Occam's razor saying that the more tools that you bring into your toolbox, the less you use what's important to you. And there's no secret sauce to this, right? To become successful over a longitudinal period needs to follow a process. I agree. It needs to interlink multiple departments, but the foundation comes from players' mindsets to work, to recover well, to eat well, to lift, to do all the physical performance aspects that we always talk about as practitioners. So without that and having a process, it doesn't work. So you're conditioning the athlete to understand what training looks like, what a process looks like, and how it all interlinks for this greater good. So just to finish, I really love this quote here, that knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit and wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. So like I said, my background is coaching. It's very practical, that I feel like information and data that comes in, it is key contextual values to achieving success, but it can't be the leader in success. It's there to prove intuition and experience. It's there to lead better decision making, as opposed to just taking over and saying, computer says this, we should do this. You need to have it to support the overall experience and values of and vision of the club to come in together to this cumulative goal. So, but thank you for your time there. I really appreciate Catapult putting this webinar on. I hopefully you've taken something out of that, and thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Tom. That was, again, really fascinating, and thank you for sharing with everybody. Again, we've got time for a few questions. If anybody's got any, feel free to fire them in. I've got a few already. A couple, I guess, just to start us off, a couple from myself were around on the individualized profiles that you did. I thought it was really interesting. Actually, something that I've not seen too much of in other clubs. I noticed that there was a risk status on there. How do you assess someone's risk status going into those profiles?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's the $1 million question as well, right? That you can look at it in many different ways, from the amount of game minutes played over the last 6 months in relation to the amount of games the team has played. You can look at it from a amount of time lost due to injuries or injuries sustained over a period, and trying to amalgamate that information from a subjective viewpoint as well as an objective viewpoint to tag that player as a risk ratio.
Yeah, and then the targets that you've set, I think you said they're individualized for each player. Is that based on the training history and the match day history, or is that?
Yes, yeah. So it's a combination of both of those. From if we've had players for numerous years, we can see what they generally do on certain days, what their roof is, what their floor is, and trying to benchmark based on game minutes, as well as looking at a percentage of game day and trying to periodize that through the week as well.
Well, that's nice. And then I guess one of the big challenges that I can remember from Blackburn days were that we used to go through quite a few different players. So when a new player comes in, how would you go about kind of setting those player profiles? And likewise, how do you get those guys to buy into the kind of new philosophy of the profiles?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really good question. That, in MLS, like I mentioned, there's so many moving parts on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis that players coming in from different continents and different leagues will see that and be potentially overwhelmed by it. So it's important that we do our due diligence in recruitment and really try and build relationships with the players as early as possible and instigate that communication so they understand what we are about as a club, and hopefully, as it's this unanimous goal that this is what we're going to do, they understand the work that they need to do to help the team achieve this success. And it's constantly piecing together information from their backgrounds, and if we can have a relationship with the club that they've been at, to have some information from the club, then that always helps paint this or create this collage of information that we're looking to put together.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Just looking through a few questions that we've got in here. I guess this one's very out there at the moment, but from an IT skills perspective, what kind of experience do you think people need to get to, or knowledge level do you think they need to get to be able to be a sports scientist at a professional level? Do you think there's anything that
I think, like I'm no expert in all these areas, to be honest. You're right. But I immerse myself in knowing as much as I can about them, right? I feel like if you can be a expert generalist, then it's a good place to be, because you can wear those multiple hats and you can walk different walks within the industry. But I think that's a pretty broad question, that you need to find what your end game is going to be. Like I said, for me, it was to be on the field and be with the guys and taking this information to support that and prove my intuition. If that's something that doesn't interest you and you prefer the side of more the data science side, I think that's generally where you'd go and uptake skills in more data analytics and using different software platforms to enhance that side of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, perfect. And just like I did with John, I guess a very topical subject at the moment with COVID going on. We actually got a question from the audience around partly around the acute chronic work rest ratio, and secondly around like how are you tracking athletes at the moment? Have you asked players to take them home, and then if they're not collecting any data, how are you trying to account for the load that they've done for when they do come back, perhaps for a consolidated pre-season?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's again like the $1 million question, right? I think there's so many people out there now in the same boat, and I think we're all doing very, very similar things as to how we're interacting with the players now. But from our standpoint, we basically set forth a plan when our league was suspended on March 12th, that we thought let's prepare for the worst case situation here, where we could be potentially 8 to 12 weeks in isolation, and let's try and get as many things set forth as possible so the players can become engaged, and we can have this performance pathway or this monitoring pathway that enhances our strategy when we come back into training. So all our players had their individual catapult units, as well as portable chargers and vests with the Vector app. So we used a Zoom call, got everyone linked into that, so we could have information from players who are happy to go out and run. And obviously the constraints around being outside are changing every day. From when we started in Toronto, you can get out to a public field or a public park and run, and that's kind of got less and less as they've closed certain public areas, and now some players are running on the street to get it. So then you're managing, groups within groups, like I said, these cultural differences as to how we can collect information from our players. And it is this navigating through shark infested waters on that side, that I don't think there is this right way to do it. We can just collect information in our best possible way and supply the players with different ways of having a physical exposure, and allowing a little bit of trust on both sides at the players, and again, setting that mindset that knowing that we're going to be playing multiple game weeks going into the season, that they need to be able to deal with that situation, and potentially coaching them on, you need to be able to deal with this situation and you need to come back in a strong possible way to be able to help the team, whatever that looks like and what your available equipment or training mindset is in this period.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Tom. I know we've got a lot of questions still in there, which I haven't got to, so I'll try and share them with you, Tom, and we'll try and get answers back to those who've taken the time to ask them. Just a big thank you to everybody who's joined, and obviously to Tom and John, two great presentations. I'm sure you'll agree. Up next on Thursday, we have Lauren Green from UCSD. He's going to present on some of his learnings from business that he can be applied to sports. I think that'll be very interesting and probably very different to what we talked about today, which is slightly more data driven. And then a Q&A session with Robin Thorpe. His background at Man United FC in the past, and now with Altus in the US. So great opportunity to ask questions to these guys. Following on from this, I will be sharing an email, so everybody who's attended will get a link to the video, and likewise anybody who doesn't attend will get a link, and you're automatically registered for the next session anyway. So you'll get a link 24 hours and 1 hour before that session, which is held on Thursday at the same time as today's. I just launched up a quick poll, hopefully, which will work. If you could take just 2 seconds just really to answer the question as to how you would rate the webinar, so that we can kind of continue and get some feedback. As always, you can reach out to myself through that webinar at catapultsports.com. And yeah, thank you for joining.